Still living here in Cesnădeia, Romania. Don't know how this wind's going to affect things, but behind me there you see blossoms on an apple tree, and maybe through it to a little bit of the fortified church of Cesnădeia. Wanted to get back into to Daniel chapter 11, and we finished up verse 1 and 2 in the last portion. So we're going to go into verse 3 and look at it. There it says, "And a mighty king shall stand up, and that shall rule with great dominion, and do according to his will." And the previous verse says, in the start of the chapter, the angel says that there should be this one that stands up. Use the same term. Not sure exactly what that means, but begin to make himself prominent. And so he stood up one time and began to conquer. And no one, here it says, could stop him then. And it says again, a mighty king shall stand up that shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will. And let me get back a note here because I'm on a different page. And read that. On the first couple verses, it says, "I also, in the first year of Darius the Mede, even I stood to confirm and to strengthen him." And then verse 2 says, "And now will I show thee the truth. Behold, there shall stand up yet 3 kings in Persia, and the 4th shall be far richer than all. And so, and by his strength through his riches shall stir up the realm of Grecia." So we see that it talks about these others standing up, and now it's talking about this mighty king shall stand up and shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will. And we'll see later as we get in, I think it's the next verse, then as I've got things spread out here, that it says again, he stand up, and he is, in verse 4, "And when he shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken and shall be divided." And we'll look at that later on, but just, same term. One time it says he stands up and he's, conquers and becomes mighty, does according to his will, and next time he stands up and it's going the other direction. Anyway, but let's get started with it. This was Alexander the Great, of course, and I won't say there's always debate about something. Somebody's always saying something different about some things, but a little debate about who this is, Alexander the Great. And ruled from 336 BC to 323 BC. Alexander was, like it says, unstoppable. He did according to his will. Even with a relatively small army that he took with him. He, I think I've heard figures something like 30,000. That may have went up and down at different times as he saw the need for it. But basically, I think that's what he conquered most of the known world with. As they returned to India then, after conquering his way all the way to there, and then at that time, his army began to finally tire of conquest. And so as they returned on their way back to Greece after years of conquest, Alexander probably died as a result of a combination of the injuries and possibly some sexually transmitted disease. We don't know for sure. A lot of that's been speculated. We know he did have a lot of injuries, and we do know the type of decadent lifestyle that he lived, and so it's very possibly had some diseases, sexually transmitted disease. Alexander was not a general who directed the battle from the rear, but he usually led the main charge. He suffered several severe injuries and narrowly escaped death on the battlefield more than once. And so he was right in the mix of things most of the time. There are different accounts of some of the details of the battles, and I won't go over some of those because Alexander the Great impresses me as one of the great generals. His lifestyle may not have been anything you'd want to model after, but I guess his courage, his way he fought, it's amazing, and I am impressed by those things. Now, there are different accounts, like I say, about the details of some of the battles. It's hard to separate some of this stuff because there's so many different accounts. I first read, some, and I thought I had everything down. I got to looking, well, this other one gives a different account and a different, or it may be the same situation, but it's a different battle that's being fought rather than one that it was listed with last time. So it takes some research to get them all straightened out the best we can. Now, I think that the reason for a lot of this is you get the historical, and I'll make a statement again. I think the Bible is the most accurate historical document or book that there is. Time after time, these archaeological finds have proven skeptics wrong over and over. When they say, well, there's no evidence of this, no evidence of that, and then archaeological discovery finally made, and it proves it. Well, it was right after all. And I don't know why you find one document that makes a statement and they believe every word in it, but you get to the Bible and they don't want to believe anything. So part of the problem with these battles and getting a correct historical setting on it, and some of it we may never know, is because of, I think, a lot of it's ego. When a king, the winning king, is able to write his history of the battle, or it's always going to sound heroic on his part. And so, things they put their own spin on it, just like today. And they brag about things, and people act like this is something new that is going on in our current political debates. That people brag about what they have done, what they've accomplished. It's always been that way. It's ridiculous to think it's something new, and it's no different here. And so, of course, another thing that adds to it is if others give an account of, even though they were there in the battle, in the heat of the battle, they see the one part that they're in. They can't see the whole battlefield. And then in the heat of battle, it's hard to get everything right. So that reason, it's difficult for a lot of historians to, even if they were there, to get everything exactly right. Also, as I mentioned, in the heat of battle, that makes a difference. Sometimes you don't remember exactly things like they actually happened. But let me start off with one of the first battles that Alexander fought here with the world's greatest empire at the time, the Persian Empire. And they had tried to invade under Xerxes, or Artaxerxes, as may be known, and that Persians tried to invade Greece a couple of times, as much as maybe 100 years before the time of Alexander the Great. But they did so much destruction, they never forgot that. And so when Alexander the Great came along, then he vowed, and Philip had vowed to do something, but his life was cut short. That was Alexander's father, who was king of Macedon at the time. The battle at Granicus River is in May 334 BC. It was fought in northwestern Asia Minor. That'd be modern-day Turkey, near the site of Troy. After crossing the Hellespont, Alexander advanced up the road to the capital of this satrapy of Phrygia. And I don't think that Darius was here present at the time. He arranged an army, some of these outlying areas, to form an army to stop Alexander. He really didn't think, it'd be that big of a deal. The various satraps of the Persian Empire gathered with their forces at the town of Zelida and offered battle on the banks of the Granicus River. Alexander and his army arrived at the Granicus River in the afternoon to find the Persian troops awaiting on the east bank. Parmenion, Alexander's second in command, proposed to rest the troops, and he would lead the attack from the left flank at dawn. However, now here's, Alexander's troops been traveling had to be weeks. Don't have anything on record of how long, they had traveled. And here all of a sudden they come upon the Persian army. And, the normal thing would be to rest your troops, and then, when they're rested, then to make battle plans. But Parmenion, that was his plan of attack, and he suggested that to Alexander. Excuse me. However, Alexander, with his companion cavalry, soon sent a contingent across the river that afternoon after just arriving shortly, as soon as they could get things put together. Caught the Persians completely off guard, and they were expecting, Alexander to give his men a rest before commencing an attack. And there were heavy losses on both sides as the first force went across, and Alexander was not in that first group. But the Macedonians were pushed back into the river, and the Persians began to follow suit of that contingent of the Persian army, not the whole army. As the rest of Alexander's army proceeded at a little bit slower pace, purposely to draw the enemy in, then Alexander and his companion cavalry, using their classic wedge-shaped charge, smashed into the center of the Persian line, which the center had shifted down to the left where Alexander was by that time. As they said, that Alexander killed the son-in-law of Darius with a lance right in the face as he charged. And oftentimes, matter of fact, most of the time, I think Alexander was right at the head of the charges that were made. And so he drove a spear right in the face of Darius's son-in-law. But Alexander was also stunned by an axe blow from a Persian nobleman named Roishex, best I can pronounce it, and a second Persian nobleman named Spirithridates attempted the attack. Alexander from behind while he was still reeling, however. He was himself killed by Cletus the Black. I'm outside here, and so a little bit of distraction. Some neighbor came out just looking to see. So let me read that over again. It said that Alexander killed the son-in-law Darius with a lance right in the face. But Alexander was stunned by an axe blow from the Persian nobleman named Roishex. A second Persian nobleman attempted to attack Alexander from behind while he was still reeling from that blow, which his helmet had took the brunt of it. However, he was himself killed by Cletus the Black, who severed his outstretched arm. Alexander quickly recovered. The Macedonian cavalry opened a hole in the Persian line, and the Macedonian infantry charged through to engage the poor quality Persian infantry that was in the rear. And at this time, and with many of their leaders already dead, both flanks of the Persian cavalry retreated, and the infantry was cut down as it fled. And so we see that the image in Daniel chapter 7 of a leopard and other places of showing, I think earlier in the showing that, Alexander as a ram that came charging, with his feet not touching the ground. Those are both very accurate descriptions, that and the leopard with the 4 wings, because that was one of the things that led to Alexander's success, was his speed that he traveled. He traveled light with a light army, and he was many times often up on his prey or his enemy before they expected it, or like in this case, they expected a rest to take place, and instead he charges right in. And so then next one is the look at the Battle of Issus. It took place in November 333 BC. After Alexander's forces successfully defeated the Persians at the Battle of Granicus, Darius took personal charge of his army. He gathered a large army from the depths of the empire and maneuvered to cut the Greek line of supply. Now, initially, Alexander chose what was apparently unfavorable ground. He personally led the more elite Greek companion cavalry against the Persian left up against the hills and cut up the enemy on the less encumbering terrain, and thereby generating a quick rout. Alexander then mounted his horse Bucephalus, took his place at the head of his companion cavalry, and led a direct assault against Darius. And it said that the horses that were pulling Darius' chariot was injured and began tossing at the yoke, and Darius, about to fall off his chariot, instead jumped off. He threw his royal diadem away, mounted the horse, and fled the scene, leaving behind his mother, his wife, and daughter. The Persian troops, realizing they had lost, either surrendered or fled with their hapless king. The Macedonian cavalry pursued the fleeing Persians for as long as there was light that day. And so a great victory again, as Alexander proved unstoppable as he went against the Persians. We'll look at one more here, and as we look at these battles, because there was one more after Alexander, this victory, pretty much had control, but not total control of Persia. But he withdrew and went to conquer Egypt and other areas before returning to Persia in 331 BC. He crossed the Hellespont with 40,000 men this time. And so they faced a Persian cavalry of 34,000. The total numbers of the Persian army have been estimated by historians at a minimum of 200,000, and by some at many more than that. So you're talking about an army of 40,000 that, as I said earlier, normal for him, and oftentimes Alexander traveled with about 30,000. So in this case, he's got 40,000 and over 200,000 on the Persian side. And that's what makes Alexander, in my eyes, so great general. The battle took place at Gaugamela, near present-day Mosul in northern Iraq, where Darius had specially prepared the battlefield to benefit his chariots, which had scythes protruding from the wheels to cripple Alexander's horses. Alexander's forces simply outmaneuvered the chariots by moving to the side and charging past. Many of the charioteers were also killed by Alexander's spearmen. Their longer spears also gave them an advantage over the swords of the Persians. There are different accounts of the battle. As I said before, it's a neat battle. It's not unusual. But most accounts seem to agree that Alexander began by ordering his infantry to march in phalanx formation towards the center of the enemy line. Darius now launched his chariots, as I said before, up the middle, and Darius, his charioteer this time, was killed by a spear, and chaos rang out as everyone incorrectly thought it was Darius who had been killed. And the Persian line then collapsed, and again Darius fled the battlefield. This time Alexander did not give up the chase, covering 400 miles in 11 days. However, the pursuit lasted 9 months overall. He stopped and rested his troops, his army in Babylon for 9 months, I think, or close to that, several months anyway. And then before they finished their pursuit of Darius. Seeing Alexander's determination, one of Darius' generals stabbed him and left him to die by the wayside for Alexander to find. And 1 year later, after that, Alexander and his army were in Afghanistan. Now, I said that the that Darius was still alive when Alexander found him. So they, had just stabbed him not too long as Alexander was beginning to close in on him. And I think they left him tied to wagon there or something, and Alexander cared for him, what he could, and actually gave him a decent burial after that, for a king, because he was a king. And then in verse 4, and we're not going to go much. I thought I'd get further than this, but we'll look a little further at what happens. 1 year later, his army was in Afghanistan. It says in verse 4, it says, and when he shall stand up, still talking about Alexander, his kingdom shall be broken and shall be divided toward the four winds of heaven, and not to his posterity, nor according to his dominion which he ruled. For his kingdom shall be plucked up even for others beside those. And what happened, I just got a little bit right here to finish up on this part. When Alexander died, the Greek kingdom was divided among his four generals. Two of the generals, Ptolemy and Seleucus, soon proved to be the more powerful. And so it came down to the two empires after that. Egypt was ruled by Greek under Ptolemy, king of the south. And we're going to see a lot of that, king of the south, king of the north. While Seleucus, king of the north, extended his kingdom to include what is today Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. Israel was again caught between two major powers that had been so many times before, between Egypt and Assyria and then Babylon. And so we'll stop there, and next session we'll look at Cleopatra. And a lot of people will say, Cleopatra, didn't know she was in the Bible. This Cleopatra happens to be Alexander's sister. So it's long before the more famous Cleopatra came along, but yet this Cleopatra had her own place in history, and a lot of intrigue there also. And so we'll take a look at that, and we'll pick it up later.